the whole diet industry and the influencer industry is predicated on clickbait, and clickbait is most often driven by fear. And so the best thing to do is to say, avoid these 7 dangerous foods, or tune in for the one food that gets rid of belly fat, or, it's like all this rubbish about and eliminate the white stuff and so on. So much of our focus is on eliminating stuff and being afraid of it. I can make you afraid of it. I can make you afraid of the water you're drinking. I can make you afraid of the fish you're eating. I can make you afraid of the beef you eat. I can make you afraid of the pasta. I mean, you can be afraid of it all. But what you have to remember is that your health is far more determined by your body getting its physical needs met. If I took a human and put them in a perfect environment, a sealed dome where they had the perfect light, the perfect air, the perfect water, they had the perfect nutrition according to human history, everything was perfect. They never had junk food. They never had additives. They never had glyphosate. It's perfect. They're going to be pretty healthy. But if I use some weird nanobot technology to remove vitamin C from their citrus and liver foods, and that's all I do, they're going to get sick and they're going to die.
You're listening to the Born Primitive Podcast.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Born Primitive Podcast. Good morning, Tony.
Morning, Bear.
How we doing today?
Doing good.
All right. Well, today's guest, Eric Edmeades, is an author, speaker, entrepreneur, and leading expert in behavioral change dynamics. Eric is the author of The Evolution Gap and Post Diabetic. He is also the founder and CEO of WildFit Health Transformation Program. You can find his podcast, Unforgettable, on all major platforms and learn more at ericedmeades.com, as well as find him on Instagram. But Eric, welcome to the Born Primitive Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I think to get into this, Eric, we learned a little bit about your background, and I kind of want to zoom out a bit. You, as I understand it, you went from being a homeless person in Northern Canada as a young buck to becoming, a very successful man in a variety of disciplines and efforts. So bridge that gap for us, please.
Well, I would just make one correction. There's a vast difference between being homeless and becoming a homeless person. And what I mean by that is that, I had a fairly significant disagreement with my father that resulted in me being kicked out of the house. And so for about 4 months of grade 10, through a combination of couch surfing and finding warm places to sleep, I was homeless. But I would argue that I never fully became, like, I never had a shopping cart. And I'm making light of it, but what I mean by that is that there is bridging that gap. I can tell you one thing that was really a big advantage for me is that this happened in Edmonton, Alberta in the wintertime. And that means that it was routinely minus 30, minus 40 degrees, and minus 40 works for everybody because it's the same in America and in Canada. So in other words, it's not easy to be homeless. And I think a lot of times people are looking for things to be easier. Thank God it wasn't, because had it been easier, I could have crashed out on park benches. I could have camped. I mean, I could have become a homeless person, but because it was minus 30, minus 40 outside, I had very little choice but to find solutions. And the first solution was a simple thing, but there was a video arcade that we all used to hang out with our friends. And I went up to the owner one day and I told him that he looked tired and that I had a solution for his tiredness. And he goes, "I'm not hiring anybody." And I go, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying, I think you're tired because you're staying here late at night every night. I'm not hiring anybody. I go, I know you're not hiring anybody, but I could close the shop up for you. You could go home, have dinner with your friend, with your family, and I could close up for you. And then I could open it early in the morning and you don't have to pay me. He goes, I don't. I go, no, just let me sleep it here at night. And because he didn't care about violating child welfare laws, he agreed to that deal, and that would be my first sort of fairly serious entrepreneurial deal, if you would put it that way. And that I think that showed that the adversity was not a bad thing. It drove me to have to find a solution, and B, that finding the solution started with identifying his problem and solving it for him.
Yeah, it's almost like to the point of, a lot of times this is true with entrepreneurs, is that if you have a backup plan, it almost hinders your ability to really find success, because, you're able to take that off ramp, right? And in your case, you didn't have that because it was, winter in Northern Canada, right? So you had to come up with a solution, right, to make it work. And I think that applies to so many other things.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that, I think that burn the boats mentality applies in certain places. And I think lining your security and making sure you're safe applies with others.
Yes.
And I'll give you an example that by the time I started WildFit, I solved the money mysteries in my life to a large degree. I was independently wealthy and working was rather optional for me. And I had a huge desire to help people change their relationship with food. And so I started a hobby. And that hobby was to help people change. Like, what I recognized was diets don't work. And, they work for the 2 or 3% of people that have this stone cold, determination and willpower that they can stick with something. But we know that industry on the whole doesn't work. And so I wanted to solve that problem. And it was a hobby. And what started off as a hobby, and bear in mind, if I needed to make money, I couldn't have done this. If I needed to make money, I couldn't have devoted as much time and resource to that particular thing. But because I didn't need to make money, I was able to follow my passion, and I started the program, and then it took off on me. I mean, it really went from being a hobby where I had, 100 and 150 clients a year, just a fun little hobby, to literally in 1 year going to 3,500 clients. And since then now over 100,000 people around the world. And I would say that, so what I'm getting at is that I think the burn the boats mentality really helps in certain circumstances. There's no question that a backup plan can actually be too comfortable, but then there's another level of creativity and another level of innovation that I think requires the freedom of security in order to do it. And I think finding the balance between those things is a big key to life.
Yeah, it's a great call out. Eric, kind of on that same thread, I'd love for you to talk about, I heard when you were 20, and I think it might have been on Jordan Peterson's podcast, when you mentioned at the age of 20, you found yourself sick all the time, and that you made some changes that allowed you, like, kind of had insights of like, oh my gosh, like, look at the effect food is having on me. But something, as you guys discussed it, that I found that resonated with me, and I've seen this in my own life and in others, is that you said it actually gave you an opportunity to combine, because what you just said, people don't listen to rules to begin with, let alone like nutrition advice is a whole nother layer to that you kind of said you were able to combine like practical psychology with your passion for anthropology, nutrition, and then behavioral change. I'd love to hear you kind of dissect each of those pillars. What drew you to those? Was that just something innate in you that you found that you were kind of drawn to, or what allowed you kind of to develop those pillars and then apply them to something like the nutrition side of things?
There's a lot in that, and I'm gonna just start with a little discussion about education. Generally speaking, is that education, as it was set up and as we live with it today, seems designed to sharpen your brain to a point, to get you to a point where there is a singular truth, and that becomes your truth, and that's the only thing that you can see, and that's the only right, and that creates great things. You would want your brain surgeon to have that kind of intelligence, as far as I can tell. You'd want the engineer designing a huge building to have that kind of intelligence. But it also creates a problem of focus. And I think that sometimes there are unbelievable observations in the world that need to be made by cross disciplines, by disciplines being combined. And I can give you a great example of that from my dad. My dad didn't want to go to law school. He came from that generation where your parents still could tell you what to do, and they forced him to go to law school. And I think it's a mark of how smart he was, that despite not wanting to go to law school, he graduated top of his class. That's impressive. By the way, he was at McGill, so we're not, we're at a serious law school. But the next thing is that his real passion was about science. And so if you go to the Lascaux Caves, I don't know if you're familiar with the Lascaux Caves in France, but they're beautiful caves, and 20,000-year-old paintings on the wall. When Picasso walked through the caves, he said of the art in there, we have invented nothing, because there was scale and scope and animation and 3D. I mean, it was just really beautiful stuff. But there's a rhino on the wall there. Now, think first of all about that. And I guess you guys are, I imagine, considering your brand and some of the stuff I've seen from you kind of get, that rhinos and elephants pretty much lived all over the planet previously. Well, there they were in the south of France, and there's a painting on the wall, and there's some dots behind the rhino. And symbologists and cryptologists and archaeologists and all the ists have looked at those dots to try to figure out what the dots mean. And they all have their different ideas about what they mean. My dad, on the other hand, who grew up in South Africa, went fishing in Botswana, Zimbabwe, and everywhere else as a kid, and spent a lot of time in the wilderness, had a passion for Southern African ecology conservation, and so on, took one look at the painting and goes, I know what that is. And that is that it's a dominant bull rhino taking a crap and marking his territory, because that's what they do. And so the challenge is that you've got all these super educated guys examining that painting, and they can't see through their education, You needed a multidisciplinary approach. So that was a long way to preamble to answer your question, is that in my world, I had to solve the health problem because I was sick. As I mentioned to Jordan, I was suffering with horrible allergies. I had digestive problems that made life unbearable for me. I had acne I still have scars. I mean, it was bad, right? I was in a lot of pain and a lot of medications. Finally, my doctor recommended surgery to me, and I didn't want to do that. And so I had to solve the health problem. We can talk a little bit more about how I did that, but ultimately it meant reexamining my relationship with food. Discipline number one. But then we have to move to discipline number two. And discipline number two was, well, my friends took one look at me and said, holy crap, how did you do that? How did you lose 30 pounds? How do you look clean like that? Your skin's amazing. Like, you have all this energy. You're a different human being. My mom literally didn't recognize me when I came down the steps at the airport. She couldn't see me. I had changed so much. So my friends are like, how did you do that? And I started telling them, I was so excited. I was like, look, eat more of that, eat less of this, and do this and do that. And I was so excited. And some of them would even do it for like 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, they'd be back to ordering a mocha Kahlua mud pie and whatever. They were back to eating junk. And I was like, oh my God. Like, one buddy of mine lost like 30 pounds on my advice. 30 pounds, man. I mean, that's life changing, especially in your early 20s, right? Like, that's a big deal. And then within a few months, he'd put the 30 back on, and then another 30, and off he went. So that made me realize I had to solve the next problem. And the next problem was the food psychology. Why is it that people can't stick to a diet? And then there was a third discipline which solved the first problem. And the third discipline was that my great-grandfather found the oldest Homo sapien skull on Earth. Like my father, I've had a deep, deep, deep love and passion for Southern African ecology, conservation, archaeology, human history. And so when I had to solve the food problem, you can imagine where I started to look. I think from the name of your podcast, you have a pretty good idea of where I was looking. And so those three disciplines individually are powerful and useful, but combining them together meant that I was able to create a 90-day health transformation program that has an 85% completion rate from the general public. It's mind-blowing. We have countless cases of diabetes reversal, weight loss, babies that were never meant to be born because people got their fertility back and their sex drive, autoimmune diseases gone, digestive problems over. And we never meant to solve those problems. I simply wanted to help people gain control over the relationship with food because, in my view, the food industry is basically evil.
Yeah, well, very thorough answer, and I appreciate the kind of the preamble too, because I think it helps lay out a context for what I know we'll get deeper into. And couldn't agree. Like the book, and where I don't even think I finished when I asked you the initial question of where I agree in myself, and I've seen it in other people. And I actually, as a leader here at Born Primitive, see this happen where specialization is good to have to a degree, but then range is exactly what you're describing. There's actually a book written called Range, and it describes that exact thing, that we are under this illusion. Like, we look at the Tiger Woods and even like Kobe, who we were just talking about, like, though they're such outliers that to think that you're going to go super deep on something like they did is actually a lot, for most people, not the best approach on things. It's actually, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, is to develop like a competency in several of those, and then you will find your own unique flavor to bring to whatever mechanism you're within. Now, of course, you need a base level of competency to make sure, like in the business world, you got to know how a business works. But then where I related to even some leaders here at our organization is they'll be like, hey, what podcast should I listen to go deeper on business? And it's like, yeah, spend a little time there, but spend time. What do you love? Like, what actually sparks your interest? Go spend a lot of time there, because you may not be able to see it now, but as you become competent in those other lanes, you'll start to tie a thread to those, and you'll see through a lens. And it's exactly what you said about the people in the cave. You'll start to see through a lens that nobody else can see through, because you've exposed yourself to these different avenues. And it actually brings a perspective where you'll be able to solve issues like nobody else can. So appreciate you laying that out there, because I think it's important. Like, even when you're as now a father, when you're raising your kids, not to get under the illusion that like, oh, my kid needs to be one discipline. We need to find that when he's 11 years old, and then that's what they're doing. There's actually a lot of research that shows that's not the way to do it. So that's my little ramble, but I would love for you to lay out a little bit more of the mechanism behind kind of the health insights and the nutrition that you found, because there's another industry, as you just said, the food industry. And then I'm sorry, even the medical industry. And we don't need to sidebar into that. It's like, talk about being over specialized and looking through one little lens of a tiny little lens at the thing they learned for 8 years in school, but not seeing the 100 other variables that could be contributing to a symptom that they want to treat with 7 prescriptions. So walk me through a little bit what those initial stages look like, and then the mechanism and system you designed to get people at the 85% success rate you saw.
You know, when I turned my own health around, I had to go see my doctor because I had a surgery scheduled and I didn't want to have it, but I had to go in for the checkup. And I walked in there, and you can imagine, again, I told you my mother couldn't recognize me. So you have to imagine that visually I looked very different, and metrics wise, I was a very different human being. And at no point during my meeting in that doctor's office did any of the nurses, assistants, or the doctor himself ask me WTF. Like they should have said, what the hell just happened here? Nobody asked me that. What they did do is spend a lot of time trying to convince me that I should still have the surgery because, you know, the symptoms will probably come back and you don't want to end up on the waiting list and you don't want to be in pain. It was like, I basically felt like I was sitting with a bunch of unscrupulous used car salesmen trying to save the sale. Now, I asked the doctor a question that day, and I was 21 and I looked about 15. So it was pretty impetuous. I imagine he didn't like it very much, but I asked him, you know, how long he'd gone to medical school. And he sort of did a sideways glance at his degree hanging on the wall. And he goes, well, 6 years, young man. And I said, that's impressive. Like, and of that 6 years, how much of that time did you spend studying nutrition? And to these days, people aren't so shocked by the answer anymore. You know, but this was 30 years ago. And when I heard him say none, I didn't even know what to do with that information. At first I thought he must be being facetious. This can't be true. And then when I realized it was totally true, I suddenly felt like I'm on a 747 flying over the North Atlantic, finding out the pilots never learned about landings. You know, like what do you mean you didn't study nutrition? And sadly, I've now asked that question of countless, I mean, like dozens and dozens and dozens of doctors all around the world. And what I found is there's only one country that has nutrition as a prerequisite educational requirement for a medical degree, and that's Albania. Now, one day I'm sitting talking to my uncle about this, who was an orthopedic surgeon. So we're talking 12 years in school. And I asked him the same question, and he cocked his head to one side like a dog does when it's a bit confused. And he realized that it was a really good question. And what really bothered him is that he'd never asked the question himself. So you know, the first thing is to recognize is that even if the doctors around us aren't asking this question, then there's a societal problem. There's a group hypnosis that's going on, and that group hypnosis is a problem. And that group hypnosis happens to be incredibly profitable for the pharmaceutical industry. And that's a whole another conversation. But to your question of how do you begin to undo that for people? Well, I'll start with this. Recognize the tools that are being used against us. If you really if you want to go and study jiu-jitsu, you can learn all the great takedowns, and that's fabulous. But what you really want to learn is how to defend against takedowns. I mean, if you only learn the defenses, you can just tire somebody out and be done with it, right? Like learning the defenses is actually, in many ways, it's less sexy, but it's more important. And so what are the attacks that the food industry use? Well, they put addictive substances in food. We know this. They put sugar in Coca-Cola to mask the salt, which is designed to make you thirsty so you'll drink more and you'll be addicted to the sugar and get that high. And never mind that there's literally an addictive substance by the way of caffeine in there. So we know they'll biochemically manipulate us. Then they'll use unbelievably manipulative psychological techniques. As my favorite example of this is watching a viral video of random acts of kindness. Most beautiful viral video ever created. It's like the most just CCTV footage of people doing amazing shit. Like this little old lady trying to cross the snow in what looks like Chechnya in December, and she can't, and the cars won't stop. And then these two young men come along and they stop the traffic and they walk her across. And then somebody drops their wallet by the bank machine and somebody scoops it up to hand. And you just watch them, miracle after miracle after miracle. And it's just on, you get the goosebumps and you're feeling, boom, open happiness, Coca-Cola. Well, what they're doing there is Pavlovian. What they're doing is putting you into a peak emotional state and bam, tying your logo, tying their color and their logo and their Santa Claus that they invented to us. So they're manipulating our biochemistry, then they're manipulating our psychology, then they're manipulating our emotional states and our holidays. You know, like you now know that there's a cure. If you ask the average person, what's the, random food cure for depression, they'll tell you it's chocolate or red wine or, something else. And so they've hijacked our emotional states and then they've hijacked our holidays. You have people that live in America that will tell you they can't possibly do Easter without chocolate. Now, I went to an Anglican school as a kid, so there were quite a lot of Bible study there, and I never once saw the word chocolate in that Easter section of the Bible. But now you got people who just and then as for Christmas, I mean, the wise men brought frankincense, myrrh, and gold, not candy cane and Christmas cake, and yet now people feel they can't have that holiday. So as you go through those mechanisms and you begin to understand the manipulations of them, and you empower people, there are even people here who are listening who the next time Easter comes along and they go, I can't have Easter, they're going to go, oh my God, Jesus didn't have chocolate. Just even that knowledge can give them what we call a Frankl moment, which is borrowed from Viktor Frankl, the idea of a momentary glimpse of consciousness that allows you to make a better decision. And that's really what we're doing. Here is what they're doing to manipulate you. Shine the brightest light you can on that. And I'll give you one great clue about this. Imagine somebody's trying to get off sugar. Good idea. I mean, I'm not anti-sugar. I'm just saying I'm anti-sugar at times. I think that there are good sugars and there are bad sugars and there's seasonal relationship with sugar and so on. But for people trying to get off refined sugar, they'll start with reading labels. Now, check this out. Imagine they read the label and they see sugar's the number 2 ingredient on their ragu tomato sauce or some garbage. And they go, it's number 2? Why is there so? And they get disappointed. They're like, I can't believe now I can't have this thing. That's diet mentality, right? Diets don't work. I can't have this thing. If they put that down feeling sad and that they're missing out that they can't have it, I guarantee you they'll buy a chocolate bar at the checkout. That sadness is what triggers the next food decision. On the other hand, if you can explain to them why the sugar is there, it is not to balance the acidity of the tomatoes, because if it was, it would be the 10th ingredient. The reason that it's there is that we have an evolutionary response to sugar, and that is to stimulate your appetite. It was a survival mechanism. It's built into every sapien and every bear and every chipmunk and every squirrel, that when you eat the fall-centric foods, you stimulate your appetite. So if they can put sugar in the sauce, you'll eat twice as much sauce. Now you explain that to somebody and go into the biochemistry and the evolutionary biology of it. Now they look at the label and they go, those bastards, and they get angry, and then they put it down and they have freedom.
Yeah, and it's funny, you're delayering something that I also find myself more passionate about than I wish I was, but I think for the right reasons, as I can tell coming from you. So how have you, so from 20 until now, I'm sure you've even went through seasons of your approach to addressing this, probably even on the scale of like when you start to talk about the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry. Are you somebody are you optimistic about the way we're heading? Because personally, I look at people like you, companies like that you founded, and then just the general awareness on through media. And I would say it's actually a positive of things like the expansion of internet and social media, is that it's being talked about now more than ever. And I view that as a good thing. Even the sugar, the people testing and kind of tweaking with their diet, even things like Carnivore are a good way for people to get a little bit of separation from what I would call is like the hum of their diet, and to start to be able to assess and say, hey, some of these skin issues I'm having, some of this behavioral issues I'm having, oh my God, I did this for 2 weeks and they went away. So do you remain, even though I know you look at the food industry, the pharmaceuticals, and it'll make you rip your hair out, do you remain optimistic in the direction we're heading as a species?
That's a tough question. I think that we're at a crossroads, and there's some things that we should remember. Every single generation has believed they were going to be the last one. Every generation has been afraid of the existential question. Even in 1900, you know how we all freaked out at Y2K? Well, when it switched over to 1900, there was the same freak out going on, and they didn't have computers with numbers. And I don't know why humans are so arrogant to think that the world would come to an end when our round number came, but we're like that. And so every generation has lived with that fear. We live with it now. We've got the doomsday clock. AI is very scary, and nuclear power is very scary, and pathogens are very scary. We are, I think we do need to be aware that we are smart enough now to create technologies that could be absolutely dangerous to us. And I suspect that, AI definitely falls into that category. But I think the other thing that we should look at, and that this is incredibly important, is that we live in demonstrably the safest and best times of the human condition that has ever existed, ever, bar none, no matter what Fox or CNN says. The fact of the matter is that the media knows that they get their traffic from fear, and so they publish everything bad. They publish everything that's scary, and they publish it in the worst possible way because it generates clicks. The minute some big terrorist attack happens, everybody goes to the news and they make more money. So we live in a time when girls have the closest thing to parity they've ever had in education, and frankly, women are now ahead of men in post-secondary education. We live in a time when despite the fact that children are being completely bubble wrapped by their parents, and I saw this post the other day. It was so cute. It was two millennials talking to each other, and he goes, don't mess with those Gen Xers. You know what I found out about them the other day? They used to walk themselves home from school. They had keys to their own houses and they made their own meals. Don't fuck with them. And it's like, I think there's something to that, right? And now the kids are bubble wrapped. If you leave your kids at the park, some neighbor's going to call social services and say you're a bad parent. And yet what's crazy is that crimes against children statistically are literally half of what they were in 1970. We live in the very best time to be alive. So in that sense, I'm pretty damn optimistic. We are also in a place where capitalism, which is the best system we currently have for value exchange, is absolutely devastating when it comes to healthcare and food production. And as long as capitalism maintains the food production world and the pharmaceutical world, we're in deep trouble. And so, funny enough, you mentioned in the introduction, I just pre-released this book called The Evolution Gap. And The Evolution Gap talks about a disparity between our biological evolution, which is painfully slow, and our incredible and accelerating capacity for innovation. And I would put to you that almost every disease, every mental health issue, and almost all social issues owe themselves or their severity to that gap. And so some people hear me talk about that and they go, oh, are you suggesting that we sell everything and go and move to the forest and live a primitive life? I'm like, well, if you would enjoy that, I think it's not a bad idea at all. But I think the bigger opportunity here is to take the wisdom from what we know about our evolutionary history and our ancestral past and the incredible innovations we're making and marry those things to create the most phenomenal quality of life possible. And I know that that's true on an individual basis today. And I believe that on a social level, it's possible that we can do that for everybody.
And could you, because one of the threads that we always try to pull out on this podcast is kind of giving people practical takeaways for their everyday life, and both the physical kind of workout, nutrition, and then just optimization as a whole, whether it be having people like yourself who are a kind of a blend of all, or having people purely on kind of the psychological performance side. So what are some of those bridgings? Because I love that. I think combining ancient wisdom with like modern day innovation. What are some practical takeaways or some things that you say like people could integrate into their everyday life surrounding, hey, the food, the movement? Like, what are some practical takeaways that you kind of hang your hat on that help bridge those two worlds?
One of them is defining principles. I think that having a good set of defining principles matters. And so I'll give you one of our principles at WildFit. And the principle works like this. Any food or fitness fad, advice, research paper, study, or theme that you run into ever that contradicts evolutionary biology must be considered suspect. Now, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it must be considered suspect. So if somebody comes along and says to you, avocados are imperative to your existence as a human being, well, no. They may be good for us and they have healthy fats in them and they've got folic acid and, they don't seem to be an attacking plant like many. But as most of us genetically encountered avocados for the very first time in the last couple hundred years, it cannot be argued that they're essential. And so, every research study, when the Daily Mail in England comes out one day and says eggs cause diabetes, and then on the other side, they say eggs fight diabetes. Well, you don't even have to read either of those studies to know which of those stories is bullshit, because evolutionary biology, it tells you the answer to that. And I think that having that as a guiding principle helps a great deal, because then it becomes much easier to avoid the pitfalls. I'll give you kind of a good example. All the rave at the moment is to get your CGM. You got to get your constant glucose monitor, get that thing on your arm and your glucose, and then try to flatline your glucose. I mean, that's what you got to do, right? Sit and watch it. Oh, I had a bran muffin this morning. It didn't spike my glucose. Must mean it's good for me. All right. Now, what I would say is I'm not against CGMs. I think they could be useful, but let's take a look at evolutionary biology for a minute. Did our ancestors spike their blood sugar? Hell yes. Like, of course they did. Like, we are able to do that because it was a natural function of being human. I can tell you, having spent the better part of the last 15 years visiting with hunter-gatherer tribes in East Africa, hunting and gathering with them, that there are days where we encounter no sugar at all. But on the days when we do, our blood sugar spikes, and we don't care that it spikes. The issue is not the spikes. The issue is the floating average over time. And so now you take your CGM and somebody thinks they have to like keep it level like this. No, that's not the goal. That's not the idea. Or maybe your idea, but I wouldn't say that it's optimal because it violates what we know about our past. And so that one principle allows you to measure everything. When somebody comes along and says, oh, you should be, this might be a little controversial, but somebody comes along and says you should be a vegetarian. And, when you take a look, okay, well, has there ever been this multi-generational successful society of humans on earth that were vegetarian? No. There hasn't. So immediately that poses a problem. Now, I'm not saying somebody couldn't be vegetarian if they wanted to, but they would at least have to take the advice offered by the American Vegetarian Society, which is to say that this is a diet of malnutrition, which means you're going to need to supplement because you're violating biology. So having a principle like that allows you to measure the advice of everybody. And you need that because everybody's giving bullshit advice.
Love it.
Yeah, it's so good.
Talk about your time with the hunter-gathering tribes. How was that? What as a person, like what were some of the big misconceptions maybe you or you think the average person would have about your time with them? And then what do you feel like were kind of your biggest insights having got to spend some time with them?
I mean, we could do a Netflix special on that, and it would be a 4-part multi-special of 1.5 videos each. But let me share some things with you because it's been unbelievable. Let's talk about misconceptions. If you go and look up the Hadzabe people, or you ask AI, which with all its biases, you'll find that the Hadzabe people are a natural hunter-gatherer tribe living a plant-based diet. No. No, sorry, no. I don't know where that comes. I do know where that comes from. It comes from the same place where, if you watch them on CNN, the Hadza people are natural hunter-gatherers that specialize in hunting birds. No. No. Okay, here's how that kind of rubbish happens. First of all, what happens is somebody, and I happen to know some of these people who've even been on Joe Rogan to talk about it. Some of these people will go and visit the Hadza for a single afternoon or a day at most. And when you go and live with them for a day at most, they put on a bit of a show for you. They shoot some birds and they gather lots of plants. And you go, oh, look at the macros. They eat a lot of plants and they shoot birds. And that's how CNN got its information. Now, I've been visiting them for about 15 years, and I've done long embedded stays, the longest of which, and this might not sound that long to you, but I challenge you to come and do it with me, and then we'll see how long you think it is. But the longest I did was 2 full weeks. And I want you to know that I've done these trips where I take only water, I take no food, and I actually live that way. And I can tell you that here's one measure of whether or not they're plant-based or not. I mean, they are plant-based in the sense that all the animals they eat primarily eat plants, but when you're hunting, if you are not tracking anything and you see some root vegetables, you might dig them up. But if you're tracking something, you will not stop to dig shit up. Like, you're tracking something. The priority is this protein that we're on the way for. If the tracks are not that fresh, but you're tracking and you see some berries, bright red on there, you might grab some of those as you walk by. You might allow yourself to get distracted. If you see honey, you'll go. Honey is the thing. You'll go get that. If those tracks are fresh, you will not even see the berries. You will not even see the honey. You are going for that warthog, that antelope, that whatever it is that they're after, the hyena. You will go and you will get it. And that is the priority. So it is the misconceptions about them are largely fed from the fact that over the last 15 years, they've kind of become popularized and turned into a bit of a tourist thing. And somebody goes off and has one visit with them and becomes an expert. And then they get on some big podcast and they talk about, their glimpse of an observation. And so the misconceptions are created. I will say that my favorite story about them in terms of impact was that one of my guides, he's a very good man. And when I first went with him a couple of times, he asked me why I came back more than once, because, most people go for their Instagram picture and then that's the end of it. When I first went, you couldn't even do that, but now it's a thing. And so he said, why do you keep coming back? And I said, because I believe that there's a gap between our ancestral lifestyles and our modern living, and that there's some clues to our suffering that are in there. I told him that in our world, we suffer with more disease and more mental anguish and more suicide today than at any point in time in history. And since life is easier and more certain than it's ever been, that doesn't make sense. Something's missing. And I'm here to find out what that is. And so he said, so you think that if we lived a little bit more like the Hadzabe people, we might be happier? And I go, well, that's an oversimplification, but I would say that we could definitely learn things from them. Now, over the next couple of years, he keeps trying to get me to come visit his school. Ikawa. I can never pronounce it properly, but he wants me to come visit his school. Now, look, I've climbed Kilimanjaro 7 times, and I can tell you every porter, every guide has a school or an orphanage that you need to donate to. I would say probably 10% of them really have one, and the rest of them are just trying to get tips. So I've become a little jaded over the years. And so my buddy Gasper kept trying to get me to go visit his school. And I refused. I'm like, I've visited it. I've literally built schools there. I don't have time. One day I'm looking at our itinerary and I see there's a gap of about an hour and a half on our way out to the field. And I go, Gasper, there's a big gap. The drive doesn't take that long. And he goes, oh my, Eric, there is a gap. I guess we should stop somewhere for lunch. And I go, yeah, we should. And he goes, we could stop at my school. Like, yeah, he totally gave me. So we end up stopping at school and I fall in love immediately. It is the most gorgeous little school on the foothills of Mount Meru, banana plantations on the side, forests above it. Just, it is stunning. And I'll tell you what was fascinating to me is the kids were healthy. I have visited many government schools and private schools there, and the kids are not healthy. They eat ugali. And the parents send them to school because they can't afford to feed them themselves. So they go there to eat cornmeal and wheat meal. I mean, that's it. And so their eyes are runny and yellow and their bellies are a little distended. And generally speaking, they don't look that healthy. But at Gasper School, they looked amazing. And I go, Gasper, your kids are amazing. Why? What's going on? What do you do here so differently? And he goes, you don't remember? I go, remember what? And he goes, you don't remember the conversation we had around the fire like 5 years ago? Well, yeah, we had many. He goes, I asked you why you keep coming back to visit the zombie people. And you told me that if we learned from them, we could make things better for us. And so I look at the way they eat. And I decided that my kids needed to have fresh vegetables and fresh meat every week. And that's what they get. And I think that story for me is the purpose of my book, The Evolution Gap. It's the purpose of the work that I do. That one little story. And it's not just about food. It's about parenting. It's about racism. It's about democracy. It's about mental health. It's about every area of pain and suffering that we live with.
Love it. And I think there's that's a perfect example of something that I see now. And here's the nerd in me going to come out, is something as simple as like our jaw development and facial structure, along with our teeth, due to the modernization of our diet. They have seen, if you go study Dr. Weston Price did this 100 years ago, where he was a dentist, traveled around the world, and noticed that kids' jaws and face were becoming smaller, less wide. Their chins were tucking, so they had less strong jaws. And it's a direct result of the diets we're eating. As soon as you stop chewing a lot, and as soon as you're not getting the particularly fats from like fresh, raw dairy and meats, that the actual structure and development of our face, which then affects your breathing pattern, which then affects everything, is affected. So it's another good example of like what I think the worlds you're bridging, that I have an appliance I wear for 16 hours a day, and in my case was mild, but that expands that upper jaw because of the benefits it has on your breathing pattern. So there's where like a kind of my personal interjection of, I think, with modern science and technology, we're able to bridge like, wait a second here, there's something happening like to our children that's affecting not only the way they're able to breathe, but then the way that they go about life, because we're setting them up not for failure, but just in a less than ideal state. We can bridge that through certain medical appliances. And this is a guy, he's actually, it's funny, he's considered like an outlier within the dentist community because he's willing to treat this way. But yeah, just always insights like that. And I'm sure you have actually, having boots on the ground, have seen a lot of things like that, where you sit and realize like, whoa, their skin looks different, their eyes look different. And it's not a result of technology they have. It's actually the opposite of these integral things that I think as humans, we need to have in order to be in a vibrant state. Yeah,
I'll describe the life cycle a bit from my perspective. The first thing is to take a look at the symptom. What's the problem? So here's one symptom, vitamin D deficiency. So it's a widespread symptom, and it's measurable both directly and indirectly. What I mean by indirectly is, like in astronomy, you can know there's a black hole somewhere, not because you can see the black hole, but because of the behavior of the other heavenly bodies around that black hole. And so things like vitamin D deficiency, you can measure directly, but you can also see the other heavenly bodies. For example, look at COVID outcomes. The African Americans or darker skinned or higher melanin content people that lived in North America suffered much more severe COVID outcomes than Caucasians did. Why? Well, they had increased vitamin D deficiency. Why? Because their melanin blocks their access to the sun. So let's talk about, hey, we know that there's this problem. We know it has a big impact on personal and public health. So what's the solution? Well, in order to understand the solution, we have to look at the problem. What's the problem? Well, skin color. So I'm looking at the two of you. It looks like, so one of you looks like you're from Northern Europe and the other one looks like you're from probably Southern Europe. Now you're American, but you understand what I'm talking about with your DNA. Does that make rough sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. How do I know that? I know that because of eye color, hair color, skin color. Humans evolved as we moved away from the equator, lighter and lighter hair and skin color in order to allow more of the sun in. And this is not a process of migration. It's not like people like marched north. I'm going to go to Norway. What happened is the human population grew. In fact, I would argue to some degree, it's like the meekest, the weakest were pushed away as the population grew. And they were forced to eke out an existence first in Northern Africa, then in Southern Europe, and then in Northern Europe. And the weakest of them all were pushed up into the Northern hemisphere where they had to deal with snow and ice. You can't imagine they chose that. You can't imagine that was like, hey, let's go live up there. But in a very real sense, the meekest ended up inheriting the earth because they faced the toughest conditions on earth and had to evolve technologies and had to lighten their skin in order to get more sun. And all these things happen. Now that's evolution and it works. It works. If you live in Nigeria, you want a lot of melanin. If you live in Estonia, you don't want much at all. Fine. But now you have the possibility of getting in a car or on a plane and traveling to somewhere with a different sun relationship. And you can travel a distance that used to take 20,000 years to travel. Because remember, they weren't walking it, they were expanding it, right? So you can now travel that distance in an afternoon, and suddenly you find yourself in a place with either too much or too little sun. So if you're a Nigerian living in Norway, you have a problem. And if you're a Norwegian living in Nigeria, you have a problem. So let's say you're the latter. You have a vitamin D deficiency because you've got the wrong skin color for where you live, or you have the right skin color, but you wear clothes all the time and you put sunblock on all the time and you're indoors and you're in your car. So even in your right location, you're not getting enough sunlight. What do? Step one, whenever we're trying to close the gap, is to find the natural solution. And of course, the natural solution is to get outside and take off your clothes and be in the sun. Like that's the natural solution. Like, I don't know if you have to go Dave Asprey level and suntan your taint, but you do have to get out there and get some sun, but then the problem is if you live in Seattle, they don't have that there. I'm kidding, but you live in Vancouver, you live in England, you live in Scotland. Now you might have to look beyond the natural health way, and you might need to look at things like vitamin D supplementation, red light therapy, and the like. And so that's a great example of how, hey, there's the gap. We know what's causing the problem and we know the natural solution. And if it's available, that should always be our first choice. But if it's not available, we've developed incredible technologies to solve the problem.
Love it.
So good, man. There's so many examples of that too. That's the perfect kind of parallel to what you said earlier. I'm curious from a nutritional aspect of WildFit, are there kind of key tenets that are consistent? And could you walk the viewers through like kind of what the program is? And we're definitely kind of nutrition and human performance dorks here, so I'd be curious to know what are the kind of the key pillars of this.
So obviously we're all at this table going to be familiar with Loren Cordain, and so I had a chat with him a couple of years ago, and I asked him what gave him the idea. And the reason I asked him that is that I had written an essay back in the early 90s called The Human Diet. And I was a kid. And then all of a sudden the paleo diet book came out and I had two conflicting emotions. The first emotion was vindication that this theory that I'd stumbled onto had legs, that a doctor had written about it and a book had been published about it. But the other thing is I felt very much like my original idea had been hijacked from me and I should have, if I'd been older, if I'd known more, I would have done more with it. That's the selfish ego part of anybody, I suppose. And, but then I asked Loren, I said, where did you come up with the idea? I wanted to know, I knew my origin. I was curious what his origin was. And the funny thing is my origin was a combination of my grandfather finding this old sapien skull. He found the oldest Homo sapiens skull in history at that point, 259,000 years old. And as a kid, I was transfixed by that idea. So naturally, my mind was already thinking a great deal about early human evolution and what have you. Then I read an article by S. Boyd Eaton that was written in about 1984. And I read it in the early 90s when it made its way onto the internet. I was an early internet person. And I found this article on a bulletin board somewhere. And I asked Loren, where did you get the idea for paleo? And he goes, article by S. Boyd Eaton. So it was the same article. And the article basically suggested something to this effect that, species evolve an evolutionary relationship with their prey. And that evolutionary relationship involves the ability to capture, process, and then utilize that nutrition. And every species has one of these. And the degree to which a species is aligned with its diet is the degree to which it'll be experiencing optimal health. Basic idea. And that humans are also animals, and we're also part of that kingdom. And as a consequence, the same truth applies to us. So where I'm going with this is that some of the principles that we talk about in WildFit are very, very similar to what you would talk about in the sort of origin diet or paleo diet or that type of thought process. But I would put that there's a fairly significant difference, and that is that the paleo diet focuses largely on what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, right? You should eat things that come from the Paleolithic, and you should avoid things that come from the Neolithic. And that's sort of the line of the paleo diet. Does that make sense? You guys with me?
Yes. And what is Neolithic again versus the Paleolithic?
Neolithic is now. You can think of it as the Newlithic, right? The Neolithic, the new time era. But the Paleolithic being the era that we did most of our evolution in. And so as a consequence, that food is going to make the most sense to us. Now, we have to be careful of paleo for a couple of reasons, is that the minute something starts to work, it becomes branded. And the minute it becomes branded, it tends to become garbage. And that's why you can buy paleo pancakes. I can tell you now, nobody in the Paleolithic was eating pancakes. I saw paleo brownies the other day. I don't understand. And the same thing with keto. Ketosis is a clearly healthy state of being temporarily for the body from time to time. But keto cookies, so we have to be a little bit careful of fads in that way, But there's another thing, and that is that it is virtually impossible at this point to follow the Paleolithic diet because of our genetic modification of food. Now, this is something people sort of tend to know that GMO is a bad idea, but they don't really understand the spectrum of GMO. So first thing we have to understand is there's a spectrum of GMO, and excuse me if this is just novice to you, but I'm going to assume some people are listening and maybe this is going to be helpful to them. The first thing to understand is literally everything is genetically modified. There is nothing that isn't genetically modified. That's the starting point. So if you are eating a bison, that bison evolved through natural selection over the period of hundreds of thousands of years through the slowest model of genetic modification. Done. Healthy, good. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got what we think of as GMO, a genetically modified organism. And that's where we've gone into a lab and manipulated the genetics. And what we've done is taken a genetic mutation that, first of all, may never have occurred on its own in nature, or if it did, it would have taken millions of years. And we get to make it by 3:00 on Thursday afternoon. And we expect that that's not going to be a problem. And it is. What a lot of people don't realize is there's a middle GMO. And the middle GMO is genetic modification through selective breeding. And that's why you guys look a lot younger than me, but I'm just going to say this, that when I was a kid, a strawberry was barely the size of my thumb. And now they're the size of an apple. And that's because we like to breed things the way we want them to be, and we have the power to do it. And so to even eat, say, here's a good example, beef, there's nothing Paleolithic about beef. Yet I would say that for most people on the paleo diet, beef's a mainstay. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be. What I'm saying is that we need to be a little bit careful about that. And so we bring some understanding of that into our community around how to really measure the depth of or how far something has drifted from the Paleolithic. But there's another key point, and this is the biggest thing of all. And I used to be afraid to talk about it on podcasts because I feared people steal it from us and what have you. Now I've been shouting it from the rooftops and nobody's stealing it yet. So I'll just keep going. But here's the biggest thing of all. And I don't know why it isn't everywhere, but just as important as the nutritional aspects of the Paleolithic are the metabolic aspects of the Paleolithic. And what I mean by that is that we evolved energy management systems to survive sub-Saharan Africa. We burn 3 fuel sources, and we burn those 3 fuel sources circumstantially based on the environmental conditions around us. And if we don't burn all 3 of those fuel sources on a regular basis, we will get stuck, and that will cause metabolic problems. And, the most obvious, which being obesity and diabetes, but there are many others as well. And so a very key part of WildFit is teaching people how to create metabolic flexibility and how to run themselves through the evolved metabolic seasons that humans need to have. Understanding that there's a season specifically designed for fat accumulation. There's a season specifically designed for burning off old and excessive and diseased proteins. There's a season specifically designed for cleansing out and building muscle tissue and what have you. When you and a big part of what we do is show people how to do that. And to some degree, that exists in the world right now. When somebody goes on a keto diet, they're effectively triggering a season called spring. I mean, that is, keto is, let me put it another way. During spring, our ancestors went into ketosis because that's the response to spring. Now, what we're showing people is the logic behind that, and then how to run those seasons optimally for whatever their goals are, everything from weight loss to intense endurance sports.
Very cool. Love it. Yeah, I did the paleo back in, I don't know, 2014, and it definitely worked. It wasn't sustainable though, just because like I think I did it for 3 or 4 months, but it was like anytime you got to eat, like it was a pain in the ass, but I was getting the raw milk from the farmer and all this stuff.
Okay, wait. Yeah. Sorry, I hate to interrupt, but I'm just gonna be. You guys have both brought up milk now, and I'm gonna show you something about this, and I think it's very funny. I've got lots of friends in the carnivore space. I got lots of friends in the paleo space. I got lots of friends in the keto space, and I'm connected with all those people, and we have all our fun debates on a regular basis. But let's go back to the principle I shared with you. Any food idea or principle that violates what we know about human history and evolutionary biology must be considered suspect. Human beings encountered milk in any kind of concentrated way for the first time about 6,000 years ago, which is 30 seconds, genetically speaking. Humans aren't good at that. And I know that today the whole rage is, yeah, but if you get your raw milk, yeah, look, if you're going to have milk, that would be the milk to have. Or the milk to have would be the milk that came out of a human. Like you understand that one of the constituents of milk is hormones. And the best metaphor for hormones are software. They are lines of code. And so my question is, do you really want lines of instructional code from an animal with 4 stomachs? Do you really want those lines of code? Do you know what they're going to do? So, I'm not, obviously I'm relatively anti-dairy is what I'm trying to say. But what I'm really trying to get at is that's the great idea about having a principle like that, where you can measure those things. That doesn't mean never having those things, but it does mean understanding what might be optimal from a human origins perspective and what might not be. And this might help you with this idea of, whether something's sustainable or not. This is a really important idea. The whole diet industry and the influencer industry is predicated on clickbait, and clickbait is most often driven by fear. And so the best thing to do is to say, avoid these 7 dangerous foods, or tune in for the one food that gets rid of belly fat, or, it's like all this rubbish about and eliminate the white stuff and so on. So much of our focus is on eliminating stuff and being afraid of it. I can make you afraid of it. I can make you afraid of the water you're drinking. I can make you afraid of the fish you're eating. I can make you afraid of the beef you eat. I can make you afraid of the pasta. I mean, you can be afraid of it all. But what you have to remember is that your health is far more determined by your body getting its physical needs met. If I took a human and put them in a perfect environment, a sealed dome where they had the perfect light, the perfect air, the perfect water, they had the perfect nutrition according to human history, everything was perfect. They never had junk food. They never had additives. They never had glyphosate. It's perfect. They're going to be pretty healthy. But if I use some weird nanobot technology to remove vitamin C from their citrus and liver foods, and that's all I do, they're going to get sick and they're going to die. And they've never had to worry about heavy metals. They've never had to worry about glyphosate. They're still dead. And so when we talk about something not being sustainable, what I would say to you is that if you were to build as a foundation to your relationship with food, this idea, and I'm looking at you, I imagine you mostly do this anyway, or you look healthy. But if you build as a foundation that it's not about not having the fun stuff, it's about first getting everything I need. That's the thing. And then all of a sudden it becomes sustainable. Where it's not sustainable is when it's like guilt or shame because you decided to have an ice cream. Well, if you had a ribeye earlier that day, what the hell? Have your damn ice cream, if you get me. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was the not doing any bread. It was like, you'd go to a restaurant and you'd have to take the bread off the burger or so yeah, it was, you had to concede a lot and you eventually kind of lost your desire to eat grains and stuff. So it was cool to kind of see how you got reprogrammed. Or deprogrammed. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Deprogrammed. Do you know why they give you bread at the restaurant? Does it make you more hungry? I don't know. That's exactly it. It's an appetite stimulant. I remember as a kid, I'd go to the old spaghetti factory in Canada and I'd go there and they'd bring out the sourdough. Oh, warm and steaming with a little fresh butter. It was so amazing. Plus, these idiots are fools because I'm just going to load up on the bread and then I won't have to order as much food and I won't have to have dessert. Only guess what? Every single damn time. Dessert. And that's because you eat carbohydrates, you stimulate appetite, you want to eat more food.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely the guy at Texas Roadhouse. They got the cinnamon butter rolls that they bring out. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna eat 6 of those before dinner even comes out, thinking that I'm getting the better deal. But you're totally right. Then you end up getting massive entree and the dessert. So I could see how that works. And yeah, the milk thing.
You also have a big advantage. First of all, how old are you?
36.
Yeah, so you're right at that window where you can pretty much get away with just about it. I mean, okay, the population today is definitely pushing the idea of getting away with everything, but you also spend a lot of time in the gym.
I do.
So you have bought yourself some leeway that the average person doesn't necessarily have. But I will tell you this, that leeway starts to slip away at 36. That like you'll find that your body becomes and by the way, I think it's simple evolution. I think that what happens is that right now you'd be in your prime as a hunter. You'd still be. I mean, you see the bow that I've got here behind me? That bow was gifted to me by the chief of the Hadza tribe that I visit with. They made me an honorary member of the tribe. I can tell you, I have done the longest ever hunt I did with them was 27 miles. Just consider, and it's not some easy marathon around a track. It's the hardest 27 miles ever. You today would be at your prime, but what would start to happen is at your age now is you would start to slow a little, considering the mileage you're doing every day. And so now what would happen is when you ate carbohydrates, your body would be saying, you know what? We better start storing some fat because we're not going to be as good a hunter. And so that's why our metabolism tends to slow. And also I don't need as much muscle. So sarcopenia begins and so on. It doesn't have to. I put 20 pounds of muscle on at 46. So it doesn't have to go that direction. But I would say to you that where the melted buttered cinnamon, whatever it is that you were talking about is super fun at the moment, I would say you'd want to start becoming a little more circumspect about that as you head to 40.
Absolutely. And that's, I didn't realize. So that's the evolutionary reason behind why, like,
it's a theory. I'm not saying it's a fact.
I mean, it makes sense. Yeah, right. And the same thing with like metabolism. I've tried to, especially with girls, I try to explain this and I think this is accurate, but by eating frequently throughout the day, it tricks your mind into thinking that your food supply is consistent and it's not at risk, right? So your body's like, all right, we can run on full power mode. We don't have to go low battery mode because like it appears that there's the food source is plentiful. Or if you eat a freaking celery stick at lunch and nothing the rest of the day, and then you eat dinner, like which I'd say it, a lot of the ladies do it, or they just don't eat a lot. It's like you're actually doing the reverse because now your body thinks you don't have a good food supply. It's in low battery mode. And it doesn't burn calories.
And you start producing cortisol and you're stressed out, and then the fat will leave. We often have clients that go into keto, and particularly women, especially in that menopausal window. We developed a track particularly for menopausal women because we saw this happening all over the place, and it's getting great results for people. But what would happen is that they would have that cycle beginning as you're describing, is that they'd be like going on a diet and crashing their metabolism over and over and over again. And then they'd finally do the right thing and start to head into a very healthy, say, protein-based diet heading into ketosis, but they'd plateau out. And we'd be like, why are they not? They're not eating any carbs. What's going on? And there are a number of different triggers, but one of them was calorie deficiency. The funny thing is that if we got them to step up their caloric intake, they would start to lose weight, which is completely contrary to the diet mentality that most of them have grown up with them their whole lives.
100%. And it's and that happened with me. I upped my calories by I think like 1,500 calories, and it's a lot to eat. And I'm like, man, and I got more. I lost body fat by 2%, and I have more energy. I have to eat more throughout the day though, right? There's not like, I don't eat at noon and then not eat till 6. There's a 3 o'clock snack, and it just goes to show. And then there's after dinner, there's one more. I'm eating all day long.
Have you ever tried carnivore?
I haven't, but your brother did carnivore, right?
I've done it. Yeah. I've done it 3 times I've done a couple 3-month stints, and then from January to April of this year, I did meat and fruit. And it's I do it similar to kind of the protocol you said. Now, my timing of it probably isn't as wise where you guys are doing it more in sync with nature. I just know my body well enough to know that like, I'm not somebody who does it like, oh, this is my new diet for 2 years, but I have found a very cleansing effect of like a month or even 2 months of doing it. Just the clarity of mind. Now I'm a thinner dude naturally. So the ego comes in and I'll lose too much weight where I like to maintain a little like just muscle and fat, and you can maintain muscle, but I naturally have very low fat. So when I go onto a carnivore, my fat gets like insanely low. So for me, I the mental effects, the mental effects of keto or carnivore, if anyone is having brain fog or anything like that, it's like, hey, dude, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, just give it a try. You will feel like a different human. And then for me, kind of resetting digestion, which for some people, they're like, wait, you're eating meat to reset your digestion? It's like, yeah, if I do a month or two of just purely like mostly red meat, and then I can mix in some fruit every once in a while, your digestion then coming out of that, you process food completely differently.
Yeah, there's no question. We have a program that we call Hunter Spring. So we have different versions of spring. We have a Gather Spring for the vegetarian. We have many vegetarians and vegans in our community. They know I'm not a fan, but they know that I'm also not going to ridicule them, and I'm going to support them as best I can. So they come and do our programs. And then we have our normal spring, which would be largely focused on proteins and greens and that sort of stuff. But then we have Hunter Spring, and Hunter Spring is a simulation of a very successful hunting season, because I can tell you during hunting season, the only person eating plants is a bad hunter. And so, in hunting season, yeah, you focus on that meat, meat, fish, eggs, that sort of stuff. And I will say that I think that it is one of the healthiest things you can do. It's probably also one of the best anti-cancer, protocols that you could do on a maybe second to fasting as even a better way. But I highly recommend doing, and the only modification I'd say to what you said too, I would offer, one is that, I wouldn't only do it, like for somebody doing it for the first time, I wouldn't only do it for 2 or 3 weeks. It will take your gut bacteria a week or 10 days just to catch up. For the first week, you'll feel constipated or you'll feel diarrhea, one way or the other. And that's just your gut bacteria switching seasons. There's nothing wrong. It happened to our ancestors. The season switched, your digestion had to catch up. So I would say anybody doing it the first time should probably do it for like 6 weeks. And then after that, you can do it in 3 week stints and get incredible results. But that onboarding, I think, is really useful to do it for 5-6 weeks. The other thing is the fruit thing's really interesting. So you guys are probably familiar with Paul Saladino. All right. So Paul and I know Paul, and a mutual friend of ours, we were, funny enough, we were at a party at Gerard Butler's house in LA, I don't know, just, a couple of years before the pandemic, And he and I got into a pretty heated debate because he was like hardcore carnivore, meat, everything else is evil. And I was like, well, I don't know, WildFit, the way we do it and the time I've spent with the Hadza and what have you. And so I brought him and Anthony Gustin from Perfect Keto. I brought them to go visit the Hadza people.
Oh, you're the one who actually in it, because he talks about it all the time now.
Yeah, he Paul, you could mention who took you. Anyway, I tease him about that. But, we went there, and of course, what he observed was eating baobab fruits and berries. And if I remember correctly, he and Anthony ate a little too much of them on one day, and that didn't go so well. You can ask them about that one day. But the point is that what he saw is, and look, we can't romanticize the Hadzabe people as being the perfect reflection of our human origins. Of course not. But I think we can say that they're the closest representation that we have on Earth today of our ancestral lifestyle. And so what he saw there was the reality that there is variety. They do eat honey, and they do have seasonal availability of things. The only thing I would suggest to you is that when you're in that carnivore mode, when you're in that Hunter Spring mode, I wouldn't mix fruit in during that time. I would break it with fruit every now and again. So I'll tell you, we have a program called Ultimate Spring, and I can tell you the ratio of it. It's very straightforward. But basically what we do is we have people go into about 3 or 4 days of carbohydrates. And of course, we're talking clean carbs, like not garbage, but, so they'll be eating like low antioxidant berries and that kind of, they might have honey and that sort of thing. Maybe rice at the stretch, but we would hope that they weren't going as far as bread and donuts necessarily. Then what they would do, that would be mimicking fall, right? Like autumn, the season of reaping, the season of carbohydrate foods. Then we would put them into minimally a 3-day water fast. And they go into that 3-day water fast. It's 3 to 5 days. It's optional, but many people extend it to the 5 days. That is mind blowing. And then contrary to every vegan propaganda fascist fasting center that wants you should break your fast gently with some watermelon and a mango. Like, no, not unless you want an explosion of candida. Like what I would suggest is that you break your fast the way your ancestors did. They killed a mammoth. Like so you break the fast, bone broth soup maybe, and then meat, and then live that for 3 or 4 weeks. And then run that cycle. Oh my God, I've been doing that now for about 9 months. And I can tell you it's been a game changer for me in a big way.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because I always use, fasting's another one. I've done several 4 days, and then I've done some just bone broth ones, which have, if you need to still be like, say you can't take off work or you need to be fully functional, I've found doing just bone broth even for 3 or 4 days is really helpful.
Really?
But then, a water one for 4 days, I tell if people that are having serious issues, but thanks for adding some additional layers to that where it's kind of more of a protocol. Whereas I, and probably to benefit and also to a detriment at times, just kind of intuitively know my body enough to know like, hey, maybe you partied or did something, like take a 4-day water fast to kind of reset. But then I kind of, my baseline diet is probably somewhat similar. It's like mostly meats. If I'm mostly meats, we do some sweet potatoes, some fruit, and we'll mix in rice every once in a while. That's kind of the base. And then of course I'm always kind of tweaking and testing from there. But with a little one, I'm a little less, not neurotic's not the right word, but I have a 10 or a 9-month-old and a 2-year-old. So some flexibility there goes a long way, because you don't want to be the dad that's like, well, dad doesn't eat that right now because of this. It's like, of course, still have your boundaries and stuff, but I think I've introduced a little more flexibility the last couple of years.
The only thing I might suggest to you is rather thinking of it as this is what I do, really think of it in a seasonal way. And what I mean by that is when you are going to bring in the sweet potatoes and berries and stuff like that, do that for a couple of weeks, but then stop again.
Yep.
That's what Mother Nature would have done to you. Mother Nature would never have, your pancreas is a magical thing. It really is. I mean, evolution is fascinating. We have an evolutionary defect, and that is that we breathe and swallow through the same pipe. That's a problem. Like, it's not ideal. We've all struggled with that at times, right? Elephants don't have that. They have to. They suck the water in through their nose, but then they push it back down through the other pipe. They have to. This is an example of evolution in a sense trying to be efficient. And I would say that evolution did this with our pancreas. So your pancreas produces insulin when you eat carbohydrate foods, but it produces glucagon when you don't. And you need it to do that. The problem is that what a lot of people go do is, I'm mostly keto. What do you mean? Well, I only eat some carbs every day. Well, then what that means is you're producing insulin every day. I would rather you ate your face off of carbs for a week and produced insulin like a fiend, and then ate none for 3 weeks and produced glucagon like a fiend. And that's all. I think that having that seasonal adjustment, and I'll just say from the kids' perspective, I've got in my house, I've got my 7-year-old, and then we have a 13-year-old girl and a 19-year-old girl, who's, by the way, as pure carnivore as you could imagine, for like a year and a half at this point. And they have no issue with my choosing seasonality. Like she knows when I'm making a meal, there's broccoli on her plate. She goes, "How come Daddy doesn't have broccoli?" Daddy's not eating broccoli at the moment. I don't force the same thing on her. I let her opt into that stuff.
Like it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, Eric, this was fascinating. We appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man. This stuff, I mean, you talk about big pharma and the food pyramid.
We could do a whole nother.
We could have put our tinfoil hats on and gotten a little crazy.
It's not even tinfoil.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, shit.
Can I share one little pharma thing with you guys?
Yeah, I love it.
I'm just going to say this, that it starts like this. The FDA just recently, maybe a few months ago, they issued this approval for a new eye drop. And it helps those of us who have crossed the 50 barrier and we're having issues with reading glasses. And so now you have this eye drop and you can take it every day. It works for about 8 hours and then you don't need your reading glasses. Sounds fascinating. What I'd like to know is how much of the budget went into making it daily rather than monthly or permanent.
Yep.
Daily is hella profitable. So now with that question as a frame, as you guys mentioned in the bio, I just released this book with, Mark Hyman wrote the foreword for it. It's called Post Diabetic, and it's really about the diabetes industry and about how to avoid it and reverse it and what have you. And it's called Post Diabetic because frankly, the majority of the medical industry doesn't realize diabetes is a reversible condition. They think of it as a managed chronic condition. And it is, and type 2 is in the vast majority of cases fully reversible. But consider this. The guy who invented exogenous insulin, or led the team, Banting, he figured out that you could extract insulin from dog pancreases, and then they figured out how to synthesize insulin, and then they patented it, and then they sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1 because they believed that insulin was a right, that the people who needed it, who largely at that point were type 1 diabetics, because type 2 is still not really a thing yet, he believed that it was a right, that they had they had a right to it, and that they shouldn't be profiting from it. So they pass it on for $1. Somewhere after that, the University of Toronto and all these pharmaceutical companies turned it into a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I would just say this: diabetes is literally, and I mean literally, going to cost the American economy $400 billion this year. Do you know what your defense budget is?
I don't.
$800 billion.
Wow.
So you're talking half the defense budget is the cost of diabetes to the country for an optional, largely reversible condition. Why? Because it's unbelievably profitable to manage it.
And do you think that feeds into the food pyramid, or like the big food companies, that, because obviously that contributes, right? So are they in cahoots?
George Carlin put this best, I think. He says, for a conspiracy to exist, you don't have to have a bunch of guys wearing a mask, getting in a room together and having a conspiracy. The way he says, and these guys all went to the same schools. They come from all the same families, and they have convergent goals, and their convergent goals make it work. And so the conspiracy doesn't even have to be fully literal. It can just be actual. And so, you've got a food industry that's predicated purely on profitability with no thought to your health whatsoever, that happens to feed an incredibly powerful pharmaceutical industry that has no benefit in you reversing the condition. And so then you've got the pharmaceutical industry then sponsoring the organizations that are there to help deal with those diseases. And that if you look at the average meal plan from a diabetes association, that meal plan is clearly designed to sell insulin. And so, are there a bunch of guys gathering around a fire wearing robes and chanting and creating a conspiracy? Maybe, but whether they are or not, the conspiracy exists.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, at least more people are talking about it, and I think more people are calling bullshit, which is, I think, a start. But when you have billions of dollars to throw around and there's that much money at stake, it's going to be hard to dethrone, kind of that power hierarchy. But we got to start somewhere, and people just kind of, being able to sniff it out is the first step. But when you really wrap your head around it, I mean, what a freaking...
It's insane. Yeah, I'll go on a 2-hour rant if we start down this one.
Well, hey, we scraped the surface. Yeah. We'll let the listeners kind of, draw their own conclusions. But Eric, thanks so much for coming on. Fascinating stuff, and we appreciate the energy. Let us know if we can ever do anything for you. You got an ally here at Born Primitive.
Cheers. I appreciate it. Thanks very much.